Day 3 of the 2024 U.S. Senior and U.S. Junior Championships saw a solo leader emerge in all three sections, as only Grandmaster Vladimir Akopian and IM Justin Wang maintain a perfect 3 out of 3 score. Starting with the U.S. Senior Championships, top seed Grandmaster Vladimir Akopian won his third straight game, defeating GM Larry Christensen. Akopian now leads with a perfect 3 out of 3 with a 1.5 point margin ahead of the field. In the U.S. Junior, top seed Christopher Yu was held to a draw by GM-elect Andy Woodward, allowing International Master Justin Wang to take the sole lead with 3 out of 3 after defeating Nicholas Ladan. Finally, in the U.S. Girls Junior, we had a big tie for first going into the round, but only Jasmine S could score a victory, moving her to 2.5 out of 3. Meanwhile, top seed IM Alice Lee won her first game of the event, defeating FM Rose Atwell to get back to an even score. Going into the games, we'll start with Akopian's victory over Larry Christensen, which saw a Caro Kann in the opening, with White going for the advanced variation. And in this one, seemed like White had the edge out of the opening, especially after this early advance of the a-pawn, bringing that pawn all the way to a6 in order to fix the queenside light squares. Of course, this game was quite complicated, with Black playing g5 on the king side and then f6. White did have the advantage, but of course, both players made some inaccuracies in this middle game. What eventually happens here after knight c5, knight d4, White is doing well, but Black manages to go after this a6 pawn, and here Vladimir simply sacrifices the pawn, lets Black take it in order to start playing on the king side with h4. Takes follows knight to f5. Here White played the move knight takes f5. According to the engines, queen to g4 would have been very, very strong here, hitting the bishop on g6 and introducing the threat of knight takes e6. Of course, here the queen is hanging on h4, so White can't take the pawn yet. But after queen to g4, hitting the bishop and the pawn, Black would have some serious problems. For example, after knight takes d4, White can't take right away with check, because then rook to g7, the queen gets hit and White could be in some trouble. But White can simply recapture here, and now once again the bishop and e-pawn are both hanging. The bishop is pinned, so it can't move, and White has a very, very strong initiative on the king side. This was possibly a missed chance. Instead, we see a trade, and the players go into this opposite color middle game with equal material, but White having a clear advantage here, not decisive, just due to the fact that Black's king is quite open. Eventually we get this heavy piece endgame, again with the opposite color bishops. Objectively, Vladimir thought that this was very, very close to a draw, but unpleasant for Black. And here after a5, f4, Christensen makes a very, very serious mistake with the move a4, allowing White this nice breakthrough with the move f5. Now the point here is that if Black takes this one, White can throw in rook takes c4. After d takes c4, e6, the bishop on c3 opens up. White hits the rook and also threatens mate in one with rook h8. And this is very, very strong for White, completely winning. For example, rook to h7, White can take on f5. This is a nice resource. Not the only move. White has other good moves as well, but this is the strongest. If Black takes the rook on h1, then after f takes g6, White actually has just a decisive advantage in this endgame. This pawn will push to g7, and White's king is going to go and collect the queen side. Meanwhile, White's bishop is very strong, and White's king and bishop are actually going to outplay Black's king and rook in this one. And after f5, if Black takes on f5, well then rook to g1 check, king f8, bishop to b4 check, and the point is after king e8, rook g8 would be mate on the board as well. So after f5, Black is in huge trouble because not able to take on f5. Christensen tried trading on d4 and going rook h7, but now rook to c1, the rook switches over to the queen side. Now Black takes, but rook to c6, very, very nice move, hitting the bishop. Rook to c8, Black throws in f4 so as not to deal with the connected passers. King takes f4 and rook e7, but this endgame is winning for White. White's pieces are simply too strong. The extra pawn is not so important, but White's two pawns on the king side, the fact that they're both passed pawns, this is very, very bad for Black. Here, Akopian's technique was quite good. After bishop c5, rook e6, rook d8, bishop c6, king to f5, rook e8, and now very nice finish with e6 check. If rook takes e6, then rook f8 check, and White will pick up the rook next move. And in the game, we saw king to g7, and now rook to d7 check. Very, very elegant final move. The point here is that if black takes this rook, then after e takes d7, white is again completely winning with the exchange sacrifice. For example, rook d8, king to e6, and black will soon have to give the rook for white's d-pawn. And then, of course, white is winning endgame with the extra bishop. So rook d7, this was resigns. If black moves the king, then rook to c7, and sooner or later, black will be losing material due to this e-pawn. So very, very nice game by the top seed, Vladimir Akopian, as he is the only player in the U.S. senior with a perfect 3 out of 3 score. And in fact, no one else even has a plus score. Everyone else has either 1.5 points or less. So at the moment, Vladimir is definitely dominating the field. Moving on to the U.S. Junior, the critical game here was between Grandmaster Christopher Yu and GM-elect Andy Woodward. Christopher, the top seed and the perfect 2 out of 2 going into this game. Andy on 1.5 out of 2. This one started off as a Grunfeld with the bishop d2 variation, and quickly the players reached this endgame after trades on d4, takes, and f6, where it seemed like maybe white was getting some initiative here, especially after the move f4. But for the most part, black defended this one very, very well. Bishop to d6, king to e7, rook f1, g5, g3. It looks quite scary for black, but Woodward was able to find all the right moves in order to create counterplay. Bishop to g4, takes, and now knight to f3, check. Now at this point, Christopher sacrifices the exchange. Definitely this is the best chance for white. King f2 is also possible, but apparently gf4, the engine's already like black there. So takes, bishop takes b7. It's an exchange sack, but white definitely has full compensation here as all the pieces are active. He's got e5 ideas, f takes g5, as well as knight d4 hitting the bishop, and knight f5 check up in the air as well. So bishop takes e2, getting rid of this knight, king takes e2, and bishop takes f4. Woodward decides to give back the exchange as the players end up in this very, very equal rook and bishop endgame. Equal material. Christopher definitely tried to make the most out of his chances here. But after bishop to e5, very, very sensible move. Black forces the rook endgame and even goes down a pawn. But the fact is here, so much material gets traded off that this rook endgame is completely drawn. Eventually, white does pick up the a-pawn here and the h-pawn, but this extra pawn for white is very, very hard to do anything with. Black has very good counterplay with the e-pawn, and eventually this game did finish in a draw after some very, very accurate play by both players. So with Christopher drawing his game, that opened up the chance for I Am Justin Wang to actually keep the only perfect score in the event, the U.S. Juniors, that is after this win over Nicholas Ladan. This one starts off with a Ruy Lopez, bishop to g4, h3, and h5. The old fishing pole trap. If white takes this one after h takes g4, that's very, very dangerous for white on the open h-file. Instead, white takes on c6, goes d4, trades on f3, takes on d4, rook to d1. And here white finds a nice maneuver, queen to b3, followed by queen to b7. Rook c8 is played. According to the engines, I believe rook d8 here was better, because after rook c8, it's hard for black to develop. The knight is defending this rook, and of course can't move away from e7, but it is blocking the bishop on f8. Here, knight to d2, g5. Black goes for the counterplay on the king side, but white's counterplay here also comes very, very quickly as the knight comes to f3, looking to take on d4, looking for e5 ideas, and of course the g-pawn is hit as well. So rook to g8, knight takes d4, king to d7, looking to use the king to defend the queen side, but knight back to f3, strong move by Justin, g4, and now e5, using the pin on the d-file. Black played queen f5, and now e takes d6, not rook takes d6, which would have been incredibly tempting, taking a pawn with check, using the pin on the 7th rank. But here the issue is after king to e8, white's rook and knight would both be hanging, and white doesn't have an obvious way of saving all the material here. There is the move rook to f6, but then queen takes c2, queen e4, and the position would be very, very complicated. Instead, just his move e takes d6 is a lot stronger. He gives up the knight on f3, but takes on e7 with check. After king takes e7, material is equal, but Black's king is on e7. All of black's pawns are weak. And after g3, it turns out white doesn't get mated here and is having a huge advantage. For example, if queen takes h3 here, white's plan was likely to go queen to b4 check. Otherwise, he is just losing. And the point is that white is going to be able to pick up the f pawn here eventually, either by means of queen e4, or in case of king f6, queen c3 check. White can pick up the f pawn. His king is safe. And of course, black's position is still very, very difficult. Instead of g3, we saw king to f6 first, looking to hide the king, but queen takes c6 check. This king ends up not going very far. If king to g7, there's queen h6, mate in 1. So instead, we saw bishop d6, but now rook to d3, going after the f-pawn, takes, king e7, bishop h6, all of white's pieces mobilizing now, and black's king is simply cooked in the middle of the board. Rook e8, rook e1 check was the finish. Takes, bishop to g5. Here, black resigned as he is just losing material by force. The king can't move because of the rook. Rook e7. Of course, white can just take. And after bishop to e7, white will have rook to d3 check, among other moves. But this is, of course, the simplest, where black is just getting mated here and losing all of their pieces. So, very nice win by Justin Wang, as he maintains the only perfect score in the U.S. Junior Championships. Moving on to the U.S. Girls Junior Championships, here we had a number of players tied for first going into the round with 1.5 out of 2, but only National Master Jasmine S was actually able to win her game and move to 2.5 out of 3, emerging as the clear leader in this event. Here she plays against WFM Khloe G. This one started off as a Grunfeld, and white was doing fine out of this opening. I'll show you folks the critical moment in the middle game here after rook d8 and e6. This is where white may have missed her chance to play the move d6. Now the first point here is that if queen takes d6, white is e5, winning the piece. So black would very likely take with the rook here. And now after bishop f4, white could win the exchange. According to the engines, have some advantage. Black would definitely have compensation after something like knight d7 or knight e8. Bishop d6, queen takes d6 in the form of the dark squares and control over the long diagonal. The engines do like the material here and think white is a bit better. However, white missed this chance, plays c4 instead, but now after takes on d5, takes on d5, and rook e8, black's position here ends up being completely fine. The game ends up seeing bishop d3, and now c4, typical idea in the Grunfeld to distract white's pieces away from the e-pawn. Rook to b1 played, of course, can't take anything yet because of the queen on c7. But a6, a4, bishop d7. Both sides play around the c-pawn. Now rook c8, rook to c1, and queen to d8. A nice transition here, finally forcing white to take this pawn on c4. But now rook takes e4, queen b3, and very nice combo here from black, taking on c4 twice, followed by bishop to b5 to win back the exchange. And not only does black win back the exchange, but black is also going to be picking up the d-pawn, leaving themselves with an extra pawn in the position. So queen c1, takes, queen takes d5. This was the game. Now black is a very healthy pawn up and has the better pieces with active queen, knight, and bishop. And of course, long term, this pawn on a5 for white is very, very weak, making this a winning position for black. The game saw a very nice transition to the endgame here after queen b5, queen c6, queen c7 check, bishop to d6, and now bishop f8. Absolutely stunning move here from Jasmine using the cross pin technique. Note that white's bishop is pinned to the king, so white cannot take the bishop on f8. And after bishop takes c7, taking the queen, black takes on a3, forcing this endgame where white's a-pawn is eventually going to be lost. And this is what ended up happening after black brings in the king, plays bishop to b4. This pawn on a5 was simply not long for this world, and black managed to win the pawn and eventually convert the game. So with that, Jasmine took the clear lead with 2.5 out of 3, but managing to score her first win of the event was International Master Alice Lee. She's the top seed, and she struggled so far. She lost the first game, then drew the second game. Then in this third round, she was struggling to really create some chances against FM Rose Atwell, who's one of the players going into the round with 1.5 out of 2. Here in this position, which came out of a Queen's Gambit declined, things are closely to equal. White is definitely having a bit of pressure here, and Alice goes for the move e4, looking to create some chances, undermining the knight on c4. Black takes on a1, takes on c5, dc, queen to b5. White takes here, rook to d1. And it seemed like white might have been able to get some edge here. For example, rook to d4, bring the bishop back to g3. White can put pressure on the isolated d-pawn. But instead we saw queen d3, rook e1, and then bishop to d6, which doesn't quite work out for white. After knight takes d6, white's idea was queen takes d5 check, but now queen f7, very nice move. White cannot take because then we'd be down a piece. Instead, Alice drops back, queen to d1, and this allows her to win back her piece. But after rook takes d6, of course, the position is very, very much equal and should be a draw with best play. That said, Alice continues to fight on and looking to make the most out of her chances here. And she actually does manage to create a bit of pressure. After rook to b6, queen c7, and g4, Rose gives this check and plays queen to d7, which ends up walking into queen e4 with a double attack of rook takes b7, winning the queen, and queen takes h7, picking up the loose pawn. So black here is forced to defend d7 with rook d5. White picks up on h7, but this definitely was far from the end of the story, because despite white's extra pawn here, black now gets some very, very serious activity. Queen d5 check, and now rook to e1. Atwell playing this very, very accurately. After queen c5, rook g1 check, king h4, and queen f3, all of a sudden there's a ton of danger to white's king. For instance, black is currently threatening g5 check, followed by queen takes h3 mate. And at first glance, it looks very, very scary for white. For example, if queen to e3, then black would have either rook takes g4 first or g5, but rook takes g4 is simpler. The point after hg, g5 check, king h5. Black has not queen h3, but rather queen to h1. And white's king once again gets mated on the h-file. So here Alice plays queen h5 check, and it seems like white has nothing better than a perpetual here to save the game. The best move for black would have been king to g8, after which queen e8 check. White can deliver a draw here with queen e8, queen to h5, and objectively probably should do so. If white were to try to play on with something like queen f5, as we see in the game, well, here black has g5 check, king h5, queen takes h3, king g6, queen h7 check, king takes f6, queen g7 check, king e6, and this is very difficult to evaluate from afar. Alice was thinking that this is dangerous for white, and she was absolutely correct, because here black would have the cold-blooded move rook to d1, which is apparently winning. White has no good checks in the position, but black is now threatening queen to d7, and it turns out that white's king here is actually the one that's in big trouble. So king to g8 likely would have forced a draw. Instead, Rose plays king to e7, and this now gives white a chance. For example, the move queen to b5 here would be completely winning, looking to take on b7 with the counterattack. And the point is that after g5 check, king to h5, white's king is actually escaping via the g6 square. So black's attack here runs out, whereas white is just getting started with rook b7, queen c5, and here would be black's king that's getting mated. But Alice surprisingly repeats with queen c5 check, king f7, gaining time on the clock. Of course, both players were down just to their increment here, the 30 seconds. Queen h5 check, repeating once, giving black another chance to find king to g8, which would have saved the game. Instead, Rose repeats with king to e7. This gives Alice another chance to find queen to b5, or the move that she played, which is also quite strong, queen f5. Because now, once again, if g5 check, king h5, white's king is escaping, and it is actually black that is losing here. And in the rook endgame, after queen takes f5, gf, this would likely be losing for black, as white is a pawn up, is going to get the second pawn soon, and the rook takes b7 check. And it's going to be very difficult for black to deal with both the b pawn and the threats of white's king possibly coming in via king h5, king to g6. So this rook endgame, very likely losing. Rose tried queen to g2 instead, but this allows white to start their counterattack. And now queen e6 check, queen c8 check, and black's king here ends up getting mated. Rook takes b7. If king to g6, then queen f5 would be the end of the game, and queen h5 mate on the board. Instead, Atwell tried one last trick with queen takes b7, queen takes b7, and king to g6. First glance, it looks like completely over. White has queen versus rook, but you have to be very careful here. For example, a move like b5, just advancing the pawn, would allow black to demonstrate their idea. King h6, followed by g5, mate. And it turns out white is actually just losing. There's no way to stop this mate. White would have to give the queen and just be a rook down. Alice, of course, is precise until the end, spots this idea, plays f4 and f5. This stops black from any mating chances with g5 because of en passant. And yeah, once this was on the board, Atwell did resign as black no longer has any chances. So huge win for Alice as she gets back to an even score and can fight to defend her title in the US Girls Junior. So that takes us into tomorrow's round 4, and we'll see if some of these leaders can continue their run as they fight for the national championship. Should be a very exciting couple of days ahead of us, and hopefully I'll see you guys back here for the recap. Until then, take care.